Greetings and welcome to Ye Olde Bestsellers Book Club, where I am reading through some of America's earliest best-selling novels, as reported by The Bookman, a literary magazine of the 1890s. Today's book is To Have and to Hold by Mary Johnston, which hit the Bookman's bestsellers lists in 1900. It's a historical romance-adventure story, which seems similar to a lot of the author's other books. This was her second published, and though like a dozen others came after it, To Have and to Hold seems to have remained her most widely read, well-known work. Johnston never married, and used her success in part to help support her family, especially several sisters who were also unmarried. Besides her writing career, Johnston was also known for her heavy involvement in Virginia's women's suffrage movement, so that's nice. One of her stated reasons for supporting the women's vote was not only for women's own benefit, but for that of their race. So that's less nice. Virginia was a mess regarding the women's vote and worries about its potential impacts on white supremacy in the state. Johnston's political opinions and the themes in her works do seem to have gone through some evolution over time, but still, I bring this up mostly because To Have and to Hold, especially as one of her earlier works, does have a lot of questionable handling of mostly its Native American characters. It's worse than Captain Horn was about race stuff, and that is saying something. So with that in mind, the first chapter of this book begins, quote, "The work of the day being over, I sat down upon my doorstep, pipe in hand, to rest awhile in the cool of the evening. Death is not more still than is this Virginian land in the hour when the sun has sunk away and it is black beneath the trees, and the stars brighten slowly and softly, one by one. The birds that sing all day have hushed, and the horned owls, the monster frogs, and that strange and ominous fowl which we English call the whippoorwill are yet silent. The winds are laid, and the restless leaves droop and are quiet. The low lap of the water among the reeds is like the breathing of one who sleeps in his watch beside the dead." End quote. The year is 1621, and we are introduced to our book's point of view character, Captain Ralph Percy. And the first thing we learn about him is that he does not like, quote, "the Indians," and he thinks it is bad that the local white folk are being somewhat friendly with them lately, and worst of all, trading them guns. But I guess not all trade with the locals is bad, because Ralph has recently purchased 2 Paspahegh lads from their tribe, and last week he, quote, "soundly flogged them both," for no other reason than, quote, "he who strikes first oftentimes strikes last," end quote. I am on page 3. Oh boy! Also, I did try to look up pronunciations for things, but I apologize in advance anyway. As Ralph sits on his porch at dusk, a good friend of his stops by, John Rolfe. Now, I am a big dumb idiot who completely forgot on initial reading that John Rolfe is the name of Pocahontas's husband, and there is even a lot of discussion in the book about Rolfe's dead wife, an Indian princess. But while the name Pocahontas gets thrown around a lot in general, it is a while before it is placed blatantly next to the words John Rolfe or wife. Meanwhile, other names that I wasn't aware also belong to Pocahontas, like Matoax and Rebecca, are. So I assumed this was a fictional man with a fictional wife named Matoax, who was a knockoff Pocahontas created for the story. So I had some context missing. She is one of only 2 Indians that Ralph Percy ever managed to like, and there is a lot of talk about how much she loved the white men, and, quote, "how loving she was to Rolfe, and how happy they had been in their brief wedded life," end quote. Think of that what you will. John has come to Ralph with news. Currently, every bachelor in the vicinity is flocking to Jamestown because a ship is landing there full of women whose hand in marriage will be available for purchase. The current colony skews very male-heavy, and this is part of an effort to further domesticate the territory by populating it with families. John thinks that Ralph should go and buy himself a wife. Ralph thinks that's hilarious. 2 minutes ago, he said that he doesn't understand why someone would willingly, quote, "tie a burden around one's neck because it is pink and white and shaped with elegance. Pho," end quote. But then John leaves, and Ralph goes inside and realizes how sad and empty and dirty his house is. This man has multiple servants, more than just those 2 boys he flogged. Later, it seems like minimum a dozen, though I assume most of them are for working his tobacco fields or whatever. But I don't know why none of them can clean his floor for him. He entertains himself that night by randomly throwing dice on the table, barely paying attention, but he does note that he's rolling high. So he declares that if he throws snake eyes next, he'll go try to buy himself a woman. Which, of course, happens, so before dawn breaks, he is in a boat and sailing for Jamestown. He is a bit grumpy about it, but he is a man of his word. There is an absolute horde of men waiting in the streets who nearly break into an actual riot, shouting and pushing and pleading and groping, when they finally lay eyes on these 90 pretty young women available for purchase. Everyone involved in this whole thing is supposed to go and pack themselves into the local church for a big service, but Ralph doesn't think he could even get in through the crowd, so he hangs back by himself in the square. But he is rescued by a random preacher he's never even spoken to, Jeremy Sparrow. Sparrow looks more soldier than preacher. He is this massive, beefy, grizzled sort of man, though he does have a lovely singing voice. And he gets Ralph inside through a back door, which they are not supposed to be using, and in fact, Minister Sparrow has to shove the church's custodian to the ground to get by because he wouldn't let them through. After 2 hours of church service, the men and maids are set loose in a large meadow to mingle. The women do have to agree to their new husbands, and since they're so outnumbered, this effectively gives them all the power of choice. Unkempt Ralph, in his muddy clothes, is soundly ignored by all of them. He wanders off away from the main crowd and into a patch of trees by a river, and overhears, quote, the sound of a man's voice, and then a woman's angry, "Begone, sir!" "Kiss and be friends," said the man, and, quote, then the sound of a slap. Ralph intervenes, but not before this man manages to force a kiss, so Ralph throws him in the river. This makes the woman laugh, but when Ralph looks at her, she meets him with a very headstrong, defiant expression. And as they stare, another group of men start laughing from nearby. Quote, her dark eyes, glancing here and there like those of a hunted creature, met my own. "Madam," I said, "will you marry me?" She looked at me strangely. "Do you live here?" she asked at last, with a disdainful wave of her hand toward the town. "No, madam, I live upriver, some miles from here." "Then in God's name let us be gone." End quote. So they head back up to the meadow, where 4 ministers are carrying out all the marriages, and Ralph goes to pay for her. She tries to insist that she pay for herself, but he refuses and asks her name, and she says Patience Worth. And as he goes to square up, he is a bit baffled. Quote, of her own free will she had crossed an ocean to meet this day, and she held in passionate hatred this day and all that it contained. She was come to Virginia to better her condition, and the purse which she had drawn from her bosom was filled with gold pieces. To another I would have advised caution, delay, application to the governor, inquiry. For myself I cared not to make inquiries. End quote. Sparrow officiates their marriage, and when asked for her name this time, she says Jocelyn Leigh, which she insists is actually really for sure correct this time, and Ralph just lets that go. She's very standoffish as they sail home. She doesn't want to talk and refuses all of his attempts to be nice. Quote, if she had been one whit less beautiful, I would have wished her back at Jamestown, back on the Atlantic, back at whatever outlandish place where manners were unknown that had owned her and cast her out. End quote. Though he does soften as he thinks on it more, she's alone in a strange place, and as her new husband he has sworn to cherish and protect her. They get home, and while she's trying her best to look stoic, when she thinks Ralph isn't looking, it is clear that she is very upset, even distraught. And after dinner, which she doesn't eat, they finally have a proper confrontation. Quote, she said, when yesterday, today, 10,000 years ago, you went from this horrible forest down to that wretched village yonder to those huts that make your London, you went to buy you a wife. Yes, madam, I went with that intention. You had made your calculation. In your mind you had pitched upon such and such an article with such and such qualities as desirable. Doubtless you meant to get your money's worth. Doubtless, I said dryly. Will you tell me what you were inclined to consider its equivalent? I stared at her, much inclined to laugh. I went to Jamestown to get me a wife, because I had pledged my word that I would do so. I was not over-anxious, I did not run all the way, but as you say, I intended to do the best I could for myself. I went to look for a mistress for my house, a companion for my idle hours, a rosy, humble, docile lass with no aspirations beyond cleanliness and good temper. And you found me, she said, and broke into strange laughter. In God's name, why did you not go further? End quote. To which the implied, unspoken answer is, 'cause you're hot. She says she's not what she seems, she wasn't there by choice. Ralph says, yes, I have eyes, why were you there? She doesn't really explain, but says, quote, there was a thing of which I stood in danger that would have been bitterer to me 1,000 times than death. I had but one thought, to escape. How, I did not care. End quote. Apparently, she had a waiting woman, back home, Patience Worth, who had signed on to the boat to Virginia, but who wanted to back out at the last minute. So Jocelyn, clearly of some higher station, took her name, her clothes, and her place, and she fled this unnamed danger. She didn't think ahead, and honestly hoped she might die on the voyage, but now she's here, and Ralph's wife, but she pleads that he treat her as a guest of his home and nothing more. He is frustrated at this whole complicated turn of events, but gives her one of his rooms to herself, tells her how to bar the door, and when she sneakily tries to steal a knife off the wall but can't quite get it, he just takes it down and hands it to her. So begins their married life. Jocelyn doesn't cook, or sew, or tend the garden, so Ralph hires a cook and buys new clothes, and his main manservant guy Deacon is going ham planting roses outside. Ralph also purchases a black woman named Angela to be Jocelyn's new waiting woman. Ugh. But then Ralph gets called back to Jamestown. He's been chosen to represent his local area in a government assembly thing. Jocelyn wants to come, but Ralph is uncertain. He says he'll think about it. She starts to pout, and then after 10 minutes of awkward silence, she thwacks him full in the face with a rose she threw from across the room, and that is apparently very convincing. So off they ride for Jamestown. Along with the servant Deacon, who is apparently also like a scoundrel criminal who was nearly executed for, quote, drunkenness, gaming, and loose living, end quote, until Ralph saved him, because they had been in the same army company a while back. The condition of this saving is that the would-be executioner would only let Deacon go to sell him into service, so Ralph purchased him. When they reach Jamestown, they find it empty. Front doors have been left open, but the streets are deserted. And I got very excited that something interesting has happened, because a lot of time was spent on their walk through the woods. Some of it was charming, but none of it was exciting. It turns out everyone is just hiding in the town's fort, because a big ship with lots of guns is approaching, and they don't know who it is, so it's probably the Spanish. And we get lots of build-up and debates about strategy and whether they should just surrender or if they're too brave and English, and it's a prank. It's an English ship. They just didn't fly colors because they thought it would be funny. One of the people who disembarks this ship is, quote, the handsomest man that I ever saw, ejaculated the governor. That, gentleman, is my Lord Carnal, the king's latest favorite, end quote. Jocelyn becomes visibly pissed, and I would also be upset if I encountered someone named Lord Carnal. Eventually he also notices Jocelyn, and, quote, in a moment the favourite was before her, hat in hand, bowing to the ground. My quest hath ended where I fear it but begun. Have you no welcome for me, lady? End quote. Jocelyn introduces her new husband, which clearly shocks Carnal, but he and Ralph exchange polite bows, and then immediately suggest that they should totally duel to the death, as their first words to each other. Lord Carnal explains that some weeks ago Jocelyn, a ward of the king, whose hand in marriage Carnal had been promised, disappeared from court, and so he came to find her. He and Ralph barely resist stabbing each other, for now, but later that day Carnal does send someone to organize a proper duel. This messenger also has a bit of backstory on what reads exactly like a love triangle that's been happening in England between the king, Lord Carnal, and his rival, the Lord Buckingham. Quote, the king begins to dote upon him, leans on his arm, plays with his hand, touches his cheek. Buckingham stands by, biting his lip, his brow like a thundercloud, end quote. The king has also sent orders that Jocelyn is to be brought back to England at once, and if she actually went through with this mad scheme and married some random Virginian, he must be brought along in irons, only to be released if he pleads ignorance of her real identity and lets her go without a fuss. Ralph has no intention of doing either of those things. The local governor is helping him stall through a bureaucratic loophole, so they have at least as long as it will take for a ship to bring word to England and then come back again. In the meantime, a very irritated Lord Carnal is staying in town to keep an eye on Jocelyn, who, as it turns out, overheard a lot of this conversation, and she wants Ralph to back out of that duel and also the marriage. She's been feeling very guilty about tricking the one man who has treated her well and dragging him into this mess. But he says no, they've joined themselves together, she is his wife, he is sticking to that pledge. Then, quote, I am weary of swords and courts and kings. Let us go into the garden and watch the minister's bees, end quote, which, that is ideal right there. I can almost root for this relationship sometimes. They have some nice banter. I just have to choose to forget that Ralph is terrible, but I want to sit in the garden and watch some bees. The duel is another thing with a lot of build-up that goes nowhere. It's interrupted by the governor, and he makes them promise not to try again. So Ralph and Carnal just wait around in a tense stalemate as some time passes and the season shifts into autumn. Jocelyn is getting very bored, and one day asks Ralph if she can go out into the woods, and he agrees. Now, Lord Carnal is getting very antsy about losing his standing with the king. Right now, he is, quote, out of sight, out of mind. Buckingham is making hay while the sun shines, useth angel water for his complexion, sleepeth in a medicated mask, such as the Valois used, and is grown handsomer than ever, end quote. Does His Majesty choose favorites based exclusively on how hot he thinks these men are? Anyways, Carnal has had people spying on Jocelyn, and Ralph realizes that he is aware of the woodland excursion plan, and that makes him worried. And then early the next morning, Ralph gets roped into an expedition to smooth over a conflict with the Paspahegh tribe, so he tells Deacon that Jocelyn cannot go into the woods as planned. This expedition that Ralph goes on is yet another thing with lots of build-up and tension and promise of conflict that is resolved very anticlimactically through no action on the part of any relevant character. And we have to listen through the whole thing about how much Ralph doesn't like the Indians again. But we are introduced to two new people. Nantaquas, quote, the Lady Rebecca's brother, and the one Indian, saving always his dead sister, that was ever to my liking, end quote. So, Pocahontas's brother, which I missed the first time through. I just knew he was John's brother-in-law. We also meet the Emperor Opechancanough, who claims to love the white men and trusts that they only have goodwill toward his people. Ralph is very sure that this emperor is chronically full of shit and playing nice as part of a long-term deception, so Opechancanough isn't really that stupid, but that's his act right now. I doubt emperor is the most accurate title, but it's what the book uses, so that's what I'm going to say, just like Princess Pocahontas. On Ralph's return, he learns that Deacon defied orders and took Jocelyn into the forest, and she was immediately kidnapped by Lord Carnal's goons, so he and Sparrow launch a rescue mission into a supposedly haunted patch of trees that no one from Jamestown dares go anywhere near. The kidnappers are chased away without a fight by convincing them that they're being haunted, and everyone is rescued. This little adventure I did actually find somewhat charming. It was funny. Once home, Ralph confronts them about going into the woods against his orders. Deacon says, quote, I did not believe the Paspaheghs would trouble her, and you hadn't seen fit, sir, to tell me of the other danger. Madam wanted to go, and I thought it a pity that she should lose her pleasure for nothing. I had been hunting the day before, and my whip yet lay upon the table. If I gave you credit for all the vices of a soldier, I gave you credit also for his virtues. I was the more deceived. The disobedient servant I might pardon, but the soldier who is faithless to his trust. I raised the whip and brought it down again and again across his shoulders, end quote, until Jocelyn has to beg Ralph to stop. The power dynamics here are very uncomfortable. The next night, Ralph is sitting alone in the dark and looking in a mirror. Quote, I saw within it a man enter the room. The fire was somewhat sunken, and the room was almost in darkness, but the light was not so faint that the mirror could not show me the raised hand and the dagger within its grasp, end quote. Ralph disarms his attacker, and the fire kicks up at the perfect dramatic moment to reveal the face of Deacon. Ralph is rightfully shocked, given their history, all the dangers they've faced together, the camaraderie they've had, just as I was shocked when he whipped the shit out of Deacon, given their shared history and the camaraderie they've had. The only consequence that Deacon faces for this attempted murder is that Ralph fires him, which, in this context, remember, is releasing him from Ralph's ownership. Shortly after this, the ship comes back with new orders from the king. These have to be received and discussed by the governor and the council, so Ralph and Jocelyn have a tense evening waiting together. Quote, "You are tired and shaken," I said, "and you may need all your strength. Come, eat and drink. For tomorrow we die," she added, and broke into tremulous laughter. Her lashes were still wet, but her pride and daring had returned. End quote. Meanwhile, I so just want to call him Lord Sexy, Carnal is having an absolutely raucous party involving a lot of drunk men firing guns at the ceiling for fun. Also, Jeremy Sparrow, local minister, throws a rock at him with excellent aim. We learn around here that before joining the faith, Sparrow was an actor, and along with being superhumanly beefy, he also has, acting superpowers. He can throw his voice, he keeps using that to scare people. He is by far the nicest character. He is incredibly overpowered. He is ridiculous. I wish he was the protagonist. The Adventures of Jeremy Sparrow, magical combat priest who sings to squirrels, would be excellent. Deacon reappears briefly and sheepishly to give a warning that some guys are coming to arrest Ralph. The king's orders are exactly the same as they were before. They only managed to stall the inevitable. Jocelyn lays a dagger on the table and declares that she will not set foot on that ship to England, and her life is in Ralph's hands. Quote, "It is a wild night," I said. "I can suit it with as wild an enterprise." End quote. So off they run, including Sparrow, to a boat that Ralph has kept pre-stocked with supplies in the river. Just before they can set off, Carnal appears, and in a physical struggle, he is thrown into the boat and knocked unconscious. And as they are sailing away, they realize that Deacon has also snuck on board. Quote, "The minister, who had been a player, the rival who would have poisoned me, the servant who would have stabbed me, the wife who was wife in name only, mine were strange shipmates." End quote. A couple days later, their boat has been absolutely destroyed by a storm, and they are marooned on a tiny, barren island. Thankfully, before they all die of dehydration, some incredibly convenient pirates appear, who have recently lost their captain. Ralph, through sheer audacity and bravado, talks his way into becoming their new captain. He claims to be a famous pirate, recently shipwrecked, and they know that he's lying, but he impresses them with his dueling skills, and they decide to let him get away with it for now. Sparrow also manifests a new shape-shifting superpower. Quote, "The minister's grave, rugged, and deeply lined face smoothed itself and shed 10 years at least. From his face and his whole great frame breathed a wicked jollity quite indescribable. 'Odds bodikins, Captain!' he cried." End quote. So off we go on some pirate adventures. Ralph is not only captain, but kind of a prisoner. These men are only willing to believe his false identity as long as his leadership pleases them. But they are very violent men, and Ralph is squeamish about horrific violence being committed against innocent prisoners, so mutiny is on the horizon at all times. Also, I'm going to mention it here because it's coming up so often now, 4 times in the last 30 pages and more times before. There is just so much talk about killing Jocelyn to spare her from Carnal or pirates or dying of thirst. Sometimes it's going to be self-inflicted, sometimes Ralph thinks about doing it or having Sparrow do it, or she asks Ralph to do it. I'm starting to worry that the author has a real fetish. Moving on. So far, all of the ships they've attacked have been Spanish. Ralph can live with that. But then they come upon an English ship, sailing between some treacherous reefs, and it looks like the sort of vessel that would be carrying a load of civilians. The pirates don't care. They don't even wait for orders. They start to ready the guns, crying out for no quarter. Ralph tries to command them to stop, and this is the breaking point. Everyone draws blades. Ralph prepares to go down fighting, but then Sparrow says, quote, "There is another way. There is God's death, and not man's. I followed the pointing of his eyes, and saw how close we were to those white and tumbling water, the danger signal, the rattle of the hidden snake, the low thunder of the surf, the cry of a wheeling seabird, the gleaming, lonely shore, the cloudless sky, the ocean, and the white sand far, far below, where one might sleep well with other valiant dead, long drowned, long changed. Of their bones are coral made." End quote. He gives Sparrow a nod, and the minister wrestles for control of the wheel, steering the ship into the reef. And as chaos ensues and the ship goes down, one of the pirates shoots Ralph point blank in the chest. He wakes up 3 days later, imprisoned with Sparrow in the hold of the very ship the pirates were trying to sink. Deacon, Jocelyn, and Lord Carnal also survived, but are elsewhere. Carnal does come to visit. He has Ralph tied up in a way that aggravates his injury, and they exchange taunts about Jocelyn. Quote, "Embrace her heart if thou canst. I shall press my face against her bosom." End quote. And then they stare in silence at each other for a full minute before Carnal leaves. That happens a lot, actually. The silent, tense staring. It always sounds very awkward. Sparrow is able to break the irons that were restraining him through sheer force of priestly muscle, just so he could untie Ralph and spare him some pain, and then cradles him in his arms and sings him to sleep. He's the best character. One of the civilians who was traveling on this boat is actually the new governor of Virginia, and Ralph is given the chance to stand trial before him and some others. He confesses only to being a pirate captain by necessity, and says he was not responsible for attacking an English vessel. No one is buying it, until Jocelyn forces her way into the room and gives quite a speech. First, defending herself and her choice to flee. Everyone is insisting she must be insane or bewitched to flee from a marriage to Lord Sexy. And about Ralph, quote, "We twain were wedded, and the world strove to part us. Which of you here in such quarrel would not withstand the world?" End quote. And the governor's wife exclaims to her husband, quote, Frank, they love each other." End quote. Jocelyn is very convincing on every point except the firing on the English thing, until she bargains for Lord Carnal to vouch for Ralph's version of events, at the price of letting Carnal kiss her. It's very uncomfortable, but then Ralph is mostly excused for his piratical crimes. However, when they get to Jamestown, he is still imprisoned for the whole marrying Jocelyn thing, as is Deacon and briefly Sparrow. I don't know what they did, aiding a fugitive. Anyway, the whole piracy side story effectively changed nothing. We're right back where we started, except that Ralph and Jocelyn openly love each other now. But I also found it one of the more interesting parts to read, so I can forgive its tangentiality. Jocelyn does get to visit him once in his cell, and that meeting is very loving, but bittersweet. They know there might be only bad things on the horizon for them. Then, late that night, Ralph gets a letter signed "Thy Wife," instructing him to come at once to an empty hut outside of town, which he strongly suspects is a trap, but goes anyway. He bribes the jailer to let him escape, and Deacon tags along. Those two haven't really been speaking, but that's also normal for their relationship. They mostly seem to be past the whole "I whipped you, you tried to kill me" thing. They are also joined by a random, very chill panther, who was being tamed by Nantaquas, Pocahontas' brother, to gift to Jocelyn. I don't know why he just keeps it around town, or why it's just following these two men it's never met, or why Ralph and Deacon are not at all concerned about it, or why the tribesmen have magic panther taming power in this book at all. Opachenkono had one too earlier. It's treated as a very normal thing. I can't say that never happened, but I really doubt it was commonplace. They reach the hut, and there's a good tense atmosphere. It is indeed an ambush. Lord Carnal storms in with a group of Paspahegh tribesmen he hired, and a fight happens, which doesn't end as quickly as it should. Ralph and Carnal end up wrestling, and none of the tribesmen intervene for fear of accidentally stabbing Carnal. I don't know why they can't just grab Ralph. They don't have to stab, and Ralph is unarmed. The panther, at some point, crept inside. It's just hanging out in the corner, getting very overwhelmed, and then Carnal kicks it, and it mauls the shit out of his face, before it gets killed, and Ralph and Deacon are both restrained. Also, Carnal isn't killed by this, just horrifically disfigured. Ralph and Deacon are taken by the Paspahegh on a multi-day journey to Utamusak, which is a very important sort of ceremonial place, where they plan to burn the two men at the stake. That is just a thing that the native people are constantly doing in this book. I really think that was more of a European thing, but, we get way more detail of this journey than we really need to have, and it's another place where I'm conflicted. Some of the visual descriptions, especially, are really nice. I didn't mind it at all while I was reading it, but afterwards I am struck with just how much nothing actually happened. Right before Ralph and Deacon get torched, they are saved by Nantaquas and Opachenkano, the emperor that Ralph doesn't like, who has no reason to like Ralph either, so it's pretty confusing that not only did he just save Ralph's life, but he is inviting him and Deacon to a mandatory 5-day feast in their honor, after which they will be free to go home. It's being framed as Opachenkano lavishing these gifts and honors on someone who actively hates him, so he can then send Ralph back to Jamestown with stories of the Emperor's generosity and good intentions, that everyone can all coexist alongside each other. He's buying off one of his loudest critics. Ralph is pretty sure from the start that there are bad intentions underneath this plan, and it's actually confirmed here in the text that this feeling will turn out to be correct in the future. This may be because what happens later is a real historical event that the author might be expecting you to know about already. You'll know that Opachenkano is lying, so why bother keeping up the suspense? But constantly giving Ralph these psychic premonitions about native men bad doesn't make him look smart, it just kills tension. Knowing something bad is coming when the characters themselves don't is actually a great source of tension sometimes, and I think it's a shame that we were allowed none of that. So he and Deacon are guests of honor for 5 days of feasting and dancing and ceremony, which Ralph thinks is a, quote, uncouth spectacle that he watches with, quote, disgust and weariness, end quote, while he pines for Jocelyn, who probably thinks he's dead. On the final night, they manage to sneak away from the party and have a secret meeting with Nantaquas, who gives them a pair of knives and a warning. Tomorrow, Opachenkano will bid them farewell and send them home with some gifts, as well as 3 escorts to take them through the forest. But, Nantaquas says, these escorts, quote, if they think you know more than you are meant to know, are to kill you. They will go slowly, too, stopping to eat and to sleep. Then we should make for Jamestown as for life, I said, not sleeping or eating or making pause. Yea, he replied, if you would not die, you and all your people. 3 suns, and the tribes will fall upon the English. From where the Powhatan falls over the rocks to the salt water beyond Accomac, there will be not one white man left alive, end quote. Ralph, quote, leaned against the side of the hut, for my heart beat like a frightened woman's, end quote, or perhaps, Ralph, like a frightened person, who has just been warned about everyone he knows being killed. That is a reasonable human response. As for why he and Deacon are being sent home alive at all, Opachenkano thinks it'll be fun to trick as many people as he can into a false sense of security before he slaughters them. So the next morning, it all goes like Nantaquas said it would. They are sent off with gifts and 3 escorts, who they quickly murder before charging off through the forest as fast as they can go. At one point, an unseen attacker starts firing shots. Deacon is grazed on the arm, but they run for it, they get away, except as their journey continues, Deacon isn't keeping up, and eventually falls to his knees. Quote, he tried to laugh, then tried to swear, and ended with another groan. The ball did graze my arm, but it went on into my side. I'll just lie here and die, and wish you well at Jamestown, end quote. It's definitely a fatal wound, but Ralph stays with him anyways, even as night falls. Deacon gets very delirious for a while, then has a moment of lucidity, and asks if, before he goes, he could have Ralph's forgiveness for the whole attempted murder situation. Quote, I forgave you long ago. Remember it not, Deacon, I too was to blame, and I see not that night for other nights and days, Deacon, end quote. Which makes Deacon smile, but he goes on, quote, you said I was man of yours no more forever. You gave me my freedom in the paper which I tore. I'll be gone in a few minutes now. If I might go as your man still, it would be a hand in the dark. I bent lower over him and took his hand in mine. Deacon, my man, end quote. I have some feelings about this man asking to be owned once more before his death. After more delusions and rambling, Deacon eventually finishes dying. And now is when I'll finally confess, I double-checked about halfway through recording this episode how you're supposed to pronounce Diccon, which something about the double C led me to believe it surely must be Deacon. It is apparently probably Dickon, maybe an alternate spelling of Dickon, possibly related to Richard, which of course shortens to Dick. Honestly, it's probably a blessing I didn't know that, or I'd have made some really, really unfunny jokes. I'm not changing how I say it at this point, but I assure you I do know that I am in the wrong. Ralph, meanwhile, is legging it toward Jamestown, and his body is starting to give out, with no food or rest and so much running. He starts hallucinating, there's a roaring sound like the sea in his ears, but he makes it and goes straight to the governor's house, where there is a meeting happening. And he stops right at the threshold of the room and just waits, unnoticed, while the people inside discuss whether he's dead or not. He just stands there, not announcing his critical, time-sensitive news, eavesdropping on an entire conversation, until someone finally sees him and freaks out, and then he comes in and explains that an attack is on its way. And while everyone starts to panic about what to do about that, Ralph passes out. He wakes the next day to the sound of drums and a man barking orders. People are outside in the streets, rushing to the fort, some of whom he recognizes as coming from outside of Jamestown, from the nearer plantations, so clearly his warning has traveled. He tries to ask the governor and some others about Jocelyn, and while they all say that she and Lord Carnal have not sailed for England, when he asks to see her, they all get very cagey. Ralph demands to be told where she is and what's happened, and, quote, the governor made as if to speak, then turned and flung out his hands to his wife. "'Tis a woman's work, Margaret, tell him," end quote. "You are useless." Apparently, Jocelyn refused to believe that Ralph was dead, even as numerous search parties set out looking for him and could find no trace. So about a day ago, she just disappeared. Quote, "She thought that love might find what friendship missed. She went to the forest to seek you. They that were sent to find and bring her back have never returned," end quote. So she's out in the forest, which is currently brimming with every tribe in the vicinity thirsting for white man's blood. But Jeremy Sparrow is missing as well, presumably gone with her, and I don't think that any mortal weapon could kill that man, so she's probably fine. Everyone but me thinks they both must be dead. It's stated here that a lot of the smaller settlements and homes outside of Jamestown are being burned, which could include Ralph's home. He doesn't care in the moment because he's too upset about Jocelyn, but I'm gonna... Spoilers, this is never really addressed again. We never find out whether it's still standing or not, and Ralph never really thinks about it again. So, at the beginning, some time is taken introducing us to this house, all of his hounds, he has a pet flying squirrel that he tamed, and like a dozen servants. Angela, Jocelyn's waiting woman that Ralph purchased at the beginning, was left behind when they fled Jamestown by boat and is never mentioned again, so I imagine she may have been sent home. And we just never find out what happened, and it just feels weird that I care more about what happened to his home and his dogs and his servants than Ralph does for the entire rest of the novel. Now, in the present, Ralph should be going to help the defense of the city, but he has some detours to take first, starting with the guest house where Lord Carnal has been staying. Inside, he finds first the corpse of one of Carnal's henchmen, the Italian doctor, and further in, Lord Carnal lying miserably face down on a table. It was primarily his face, for whatever reason, that kept him in favor with the king, so now that he's been so disfigured by the Panther, there's no way he'll ever take power back from his rival Buckingham, and that's making him sad. Ralph demands to duel, but Carnal is a little out of it. He's half convinced that Ralph is some sort of ghost, and he can barely work the fastenings of his own doublet. They clasp left hands and draw daggers and start fighting while still holding hands. Carnal sort of fights back, but not well, and Ralph is aggravated because he wants to duel. If there's no competition, it's just murder. But Carnal gives up and sits back down. Quote, "Fret not thyself, Ralph Percy. Within a week I shall be gone. "Did you see my servant, my Italian doctor? He had poisons swift and strong or subtle and slow. The George is ready for sailing. I shall go with her, and within a week they will bury me at sea. I would not die in a land where I have lost every throw of the dice, and I would not die in England for Buckingham to come and look upon my face, and so I took that poison. If you are content that it should be as it is, perhaps you will leave me. I am not good company today." End quote. So Ralph leaves. He goes back to the house that he and Jocelyn had stayed at in town and finds a letter waiting on the table addressed to him from England, signed by Buckingham. Quote, "The king graciously sanctions the marriage of his sometime ward, the Lady Jocelyn Leigh, with Captain Ralph Percy, invites them home," end quote, etc., etc., which is depressingly timed enough to make Ralph laugh before he starts weeping. Then the sounds change outside. There's more shouting and gunshots, no more lapses into silence. The attack is starting in force, and it's time to go to the town's fortifications. Nantaquas is leading some of the attackers. He may have helped Ralph escape, but they did have a conversation about how his place is with his people, and he will stand with them no matter what. The attack seems to last like a minute. Then, quote, "It was done. A moment's fierce fighting, and then the Indians wavered, broke, and fled. The strip of sand was strewn with the dead and dying, but they belonged not to us. Our dead numbered but 3, end quote. That resolved just as quickly as it feels like it did. We got all that build-up, all that tension, and it ends so easily. Which I've said is kind of a trend so far, but this is the book's climax. And the author has written fights. She can. I actually think they've been pretty well done when they happen. And it didn't have to be an epic final fight scene either, just something that felt like anything. I don't know if this is a result of trying for historical accuracy. In the real massacre of 1622, Jamestown is supposed to have received early warning, and as a result had greatly lessened casualties. I doubt we know, though, exactly how the battle went down, and I'm sure it could have been written in a way that felt less anticlimactic. This book is good at build-up, but really less good at payoff. Anyways, a few attackers got pinned inside once the battle is over, and all but one are killed. Nantaquas is left standing. Everyone silently agrees to let him go, so he leaves, after another awkward full minute of silent staring. While in town there weren't many casualties, boats start arriving from the smaller outer settlements carrying wounded survivors and worse. Quote, "A woman had in her lap the body of a child, and would not let us take it from her. Another, with a half-severed arm, crouched above a man who lay in his blood in the bottom of the boat. Thus began the strange procession that lasted throughout the afternoon and night and into the next day." End quote. Ralph sticks around to help until that settles down, then he hops in a boat and heads off to find his wife's corpse. Quote, "I had no hope of finding that which I went to seek, and no thought but to take up that quest." End quote. Really, he's just hoping he'll die in the attempt. It's a beautiful day, the forest lush with flowers, contrasting against the horrors he stumbles on now and then. Mutilated corpses of families and children lying in beautiful sunlit glades. As he walks aimlessly, he becomes aware of someone walking alongside him at a distance, Nantaquas. They don't speak, but twice Nantaquas silently gestures in a direction, and Ralph follows mindlessly along, until he is left alone at the edge of the so-called haunted wood from earlier, where the trees grow so large and close together that they block out the sun. Inside, he finds Jeremy Sparrow, who gives him a big bear hug, but Ralph can only focus on the fact that Sparrow is alone, and dejectedly asks him how Jocelyn died. But she's not dead. Sparrow explains their side of the story. She had gone to find Ralph, Sparrow came to protect her, then the army of tribesmen appeared, which he needs Ralph to explain, now he doesn't know about the attack. He and Jocelyn hid, then tried to move, and were caught by a band led by Nantaquas, who personally led them to the haunted wood because no one comes here, including his own people. Sparrow then points him towards his wife and steps away to give them some privacy. There's crying and kisses and lots of I love these. I do like the visual and emotional contrasts, that the beautiful forest outside was brimming with flowers and absolute tragedy, but in the spooky dark forest that none dare enter is the joyous reunion. That paints pretty pictures in my head, and I appreciate them. He and Jocelyn and Jeremy Sparrow walk back to his boat. Ralph fills them in on what happened to him and Deacon, and then he asks Jocelyn if she would be willing to go home to England. She is concerned. Wouldn't he be going in chains? And he says, "Only the chains of marriage, my love," and explains the letter from England that their marriage is now permitted. Quote, "The light streaming to us from the ruddy west laid roses in the cheeks of the sometime ward of the king, and the low wind lifted the dark hair from her forehead. Her head was on my breast, her hand in mine. We cared not to speak, we were so happy. On her finger was her wedding ring, the ring that was only a link torn from the gold chain Prince Maurice had given me. When she saw my eyes upon it, she raised her hand and kissed the rude circlet." End quote. There's a smidge more, but that is basically the end. Now, there's not a review of this book from the same section of the Bookman magazine that I usually pull reviews from, but there is a novel note about it, whatever that is. I'll be honest, it reads a lot like a review. Quote, "Perhaps our strongest impression is of surprise that one so young, both as woman and writer, should achieve at the very beginning so marked a style. She knows, and has reproduced for us, the atmosphere of the times of which she writes, rough, wild, and daring, but pervaded by the subtle, elusive spirit which we call, and sometimes deride, as Virginian chivalry. In all its goodness, all its errors, it lives on every page, for one is not allowed to forget, though our author is no moralist, that such chivalry involves the assumption of the existence of a privileged class, which by no means looks upon the rest of the world of flesh of its flesh and bone of its bone. It is difficult, outside of the works of Charles Kingsley, to parallel the writing of this young Virginian for the breathless sweep of the story and its depth of insight and delicacy of handling in regard to the human beings concerned therein." End quote. Catherine Pearson Woods, who is the critic who reviewed Tom Grogan. This is Get His Ass Catherine. Glad to see her again. She also talks a bit comparing this book to another of Mary Johnston's, but I haven't read that one, and discusses the characters a bit. I may not have liked this book quite as much as Catherine. However, I also liked it more than I'm comfortable with. I have a very similar relationship to this book as a whole as I do to Ralph as a character. I hate Ralph for who he is as a person overall. He is violent against people he owns, he's incredibly racist, he is quite the product of his time, and it can get very tiresome living in his head. And yet there are moments where he had, genuinely charming interactions with Jocelyn or something, and I could forget that he's terrible and root for him. I also have a similar opinion to what I said about Quire Invisible in some ways. The writing on a line-by-line basis is one of my favorites so far. I liked it. There was well-painted imagery, I liked the nature descriptions, there were moments I genuinely liked the characters. But the story overall was structurally unsatisfying sometimes. Long, extended build-ups to lackluster climaxes were common, and there were a lot of lengthy descriptions about traveling through the woods that on one hand I sometimes kind of liked, but on the other didn't matter at all. There's also two plots running through. There's the Jocelyn plot and the Native American plot, and they are kept almost 100% separate. The only time Jocelyn interacts with the other story thread is off-screen at the end when she is almost but not actually caught up in the attack. And so I am left wishing we could keep the adventures with my crew of misfits parts and leave out the wholly unconnected Ralph doesn't trust the Indians and then he's proved right at the end parts. It's also weird to me, thematically, that their happy ending involves plans to go to England. This isn't a criticism, just a thought. Through the whole book, England has been the enemy. It represents everything Jocelyn ran away from. She fell in love with and chose Ralph and Virginia. And now that their home is in this time of great turmoil, reeling from the attack, they're leaving to go hang out with the king, who betrayed Jocelyn's trust and tried to forcibly marry her off to a man that she hated. It makes sense that they would go at some point. I just don't know that we needed to hear about it during the story's resolution. But that about brings this to a close, so I hope I will catch you in the next one, and in the meantime you can catch me on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, all at YOBPOD, YOBBPOD. And for today's life advice from the past, all important life decisions, including marriage, should be decided through gambling. The dice know best.